Welcome to this week's edition of Freedom and Prosperity Radio, the weekly radio news magazine that doesn't pretend to be Irish, but that's okay. It's St. Patrick's Week. Anyway, here at the Virginia Institute for Public Policy, where, we are a do tank. There are so many bits of Virginia legislative product that we've helped put together through all of the coalitions that we helped to build. Find out more about us at virginiainstitute.org. Joining us now, Phil Kerpen is one of our favorite people. He's the head of the American Commitment, president of, founder. And Philip, welcome back to Freedom and Prosperity Radio. How are you doing, sir?
I'm doing great. How are you?
Well, I have not been declared non-essential yet, despite my best efforts. But
you get the official federal designation as a broadcaster, right? You got the letter from Homeland Security, so that they can't touch you.
Yes, I do. Plus, for years, Virginia has issued through the Virginia Association of Broadcasters, this sounds so puffery when I say it, a first informer. So we're allowed to go into emergency zones that nobody else is, and obviously a lot of that has to do with hurricanes and things like that. But first informer sounds so much more important than talk show host. But Philip, here we are a year later. What have we learned, and what are we just stubbornly not allowing ourselves to learn about the COVID-19 lockdowns? Just saw a story on, I think it was Monday, where up in Massachusetts, some researchers said, maybe it's only 3 feet, not 6. And then it was, you can transmit it for 6 months on dry surfaces and wash all your food. And sure, I get it. We didn't know what we didn't know, but as we went along, we're not doing a very good job of nuancing the argument, are we?
Yeah, I think, about a month or two into it, we knew surface transmission really didn't occur, but we still have everybody sanitizing everything and wiping everything, all this stuff still a year later. So, we have not adjusted our practices as we've got better information. I mean, we knew by April of last year that outdoor transmission was almost impossible, and yet we had lots of outdoor venues closed, and now we still have places that do outdoor masking. And so, we have been very slow to respond to scientific information, and we've kept burdens on just for the sake of burdening people, essentially. Just sort of as a test of how much we hate the virus and how serious we are, we put restrictions on that don't actually accomplish anything, just inconvenience people. But it lets health officials and politicians show how serious they are and how much they care. And I think that's really what's hamstrung us more than anything, is the refusal to stop interventions that are ineffective, which has been almost all the interventions, to be honest. We've got this spectacle that the media is even finally waking up to. There have been stories about this from the AP and New York Times and others in recent days. We've got this situation where Florida, which has been essentially open completely for 6 months now, has better COVID numbers than California, which has been on continuous lockdown of varying severity for a year. If what they were telling us were true, that would not be possible. And so there's a problem here with their theories that, government restrictions are effective in stopping the virus. That doesn't seem to be the case.
But it is successful in telling you the government can shut you down, especially in Virginia, especially as, we look at a Commonwealth that I still think a lot of this goes back to the King's Grant concept of our founding, where I think it was about 5 or 6 years ago, the General Assembly passed a law, and they proudly called me to say, we want to announce that we've just passed a law that will allow farmers to sell their produce on the farms where they produced it. And I stopped and I said, hold it, you're proud of this? You're proud of a state
that requires a law?
Okay, yeah, that's right. I needed the government to tell me I grew pumpkins here and I can sell pumpkins here. But that's the sort of permit state Virginia is.
What the pandemic has done in most places, what it's done is it's de facto prohibited everything that's not expressly permitted. And so it's essentially turned our lives over to, requiring permission from government to do almost anything. It's reversed the presumption of liberty.
And it's reversed a lot of presumptions because you have to almost prove negatives every time. You have to prove that you didn't do this, or prove that you don't have this, and you have to prove that you haven't had these symptoms, and you've almost created a psychosis of trying to prove that you didn't do something rather than prove that you have accomplished something.
Yeah, it's remarkable. And the example you gave is a really good one because, the World Health Organization standard has always been 1 meter. 1 meter has always been the social distancing guideline for flu in the past, and which we believe is transmitted in a similar fashion. And in the United States, we seem to have, I don't know if it's we failed at doing conversions for metric or we just decided to more or less double it. I don't even know where 6 feet came from because it wasn't based on any of the literature. But, we were stuck with it until someone could prove that the traditional 1 meter 3 foot standard is adequate, and you need to. Why didn't the 6 feet people need evidence in the first place? Apparently not. Why did almost all the schools in the country close without any evidence that schools were a risk to teachers or students or for driving community transmission? There was never any evidence that school closures were warranted, and yet it's been this year-long effort to get schools open with the burden of proof on the people who just want things to be normal. Which is the opposite of the way it's supposed to be. And, I think that sort of every aspect of this, we've had this weird sort of, arbitrary assertions are made, and then, we're not able to revisit them unless we're able to prove a negative, which, as you know, is almost impossible.
Very early on in the pandemic, I guess it was maybe April of last year, I had a UVA doctor, very ironically named Bill Petrie, was on with us, teaches this at the University of Virginia Medical School. And he said, one of the things about viruses is the more easily they're transmitted, the less deadly they are. And the harder it is to transmit, the harder it is to cure, the harder it is to get better from, and the more deadly it can be. And he said that's generally axiomatic about viruses in general. And it seems like our entire policy towards COVID-19 has been it's super deadly and it's super easy to transmit, which hasn't really borne out to be the case, Philip. So what we have done is we've decimated so many families' lives and so many businesses. To what end? Was it just a power trip, or was it really somebody wanted to reboot the economy into something more government directed?
Well, I think that we've got a few things that were working against us in this pandemic that we haven't had in the past. One of them is that we now have the sort of 24/7 social media panic hype cycle, which was able to really frighten people in a way that we've never fully recovered from, and that hasn't existed in the past. But I think the biggest thing was that we have this obsession now with equity and with equality and treating everyone the same regardless of whether they have different circumstances or different situations. And I think that that sort of political imperative of having policies that treated everyone the same prevented us from acting in the obvious rational manner for a disease that's 1,000 times deadlier for old people than young, which would be to allow free movement and circulation of young people while doing everything we can to protect old people. And, we rejected out of hand, from a policy standpoint, the obvious response to a virus with these characteristics because of the political value that we now place in this country, especially on the left, of treating everyone the same. And I think that was the root cause of the catastrophic failure, in my judgment. I don't think it was malevolence. I think it was this core value of treating everyone the same forced us into these irrational policy responses.
Well, is it also a political or crippled political policy where, the populace who need to be seen as a champion of all people can't, for the life of them, stand in front of a microphone or behind a podium and say, okay, here are the groups that are the most peril for this, for I guess, the risk of losing their votes?
Well, I don't know, because the irony of what we ended up doing is, the high-risk groups were much worse off than they would have been with a policy of targeted protection, because what happened was we essentially neglected our oldest and most vulnerable citizens, and we had these nursing home meltdowns in all these states that thought it was more important to keep hospital beds clear for the rest of the population. And, in refusing to acknowledge who was most at risk, we also failed to protect the people most at risk. And so it really didn't benefit anyone. Except, maybe politically, but even that I don't think so, because eventually it catches up with you. And so I think, I think it was fundamentally a blunder. It was a refusal to recognize the look. I mean, for people under age 20, this is less dangerous than influenza, considerably less dangerous than influenza.
Yep.
For age 20 to 50, it's comparable. For age 50 and up, it's worse. For age 70 and up, it's much, much worse. That's where almost all your deaths are. And so, we knew this very early on. And yet we refuse to take advantage of it and to protect the people we need to protect. We're doing somewhat better now with the vaccine rollout. It has gone overwhelmingly to older people first in most states, and we're doing a pretty good job of that in most places. Although it's interesting, New York is one of only 5 states that don't report vaccinations by age. So they might be totally failing their seniors again. We wouldn't know because they refuse to report it.
And that doesn't surprise anybody. But, we had allies in Europe that were doing it that way, where they said, listen, we're going to keep doing what we do, but, if you're in these groups, you need to consider, staying home, that kind of thing. Phil Kerpen is on with us. Phil Kerpen from American Commitment, the impacts of COVID-19. Some of the things that the Virginia General Assembly is talking about is mandating, more sick leave, paid sick leave time for hourly employees, minimum wage job, requirements, that kind of thing, which I worry a little bit are going to be job killers as much as they are anything, even if they're born from the good intentions. It should be on an employer to decide that this job, should come with a certain amount of sick leave time. What is the economic future now as we come out of this? Are we going to look for somebody to make sure that if I need to stay home for 2 weeks, I get paid for it? And is that no longer the employers? And how much do we have to tax the employers to make sure the government can do that?
Well, there is a paid leave program from the CARES Act. It's been extended a couple of times now, so we do have paid leave in this country for the first time now. And honestly, of all of the pandemic responses, that's probably the most sensible in that almost all of the transmission, contrary to a lot of what we heard early, almost all of the transmission has been from people who are symptomatic. Asymptomatic transmission does occur, but it's a negligible portion of overall transmission. And so, for instance, in the nursing homes, a lot of the staff came in when they were sick because they don't get paid if they don't come in. And, you do want to have a system where when people are really sick, they don't go into work. And if you need to have some mechanism to pay them for that, that's among the least objectionable. What I'm much more concerned about in the new bill is all the money we're paying people not to work in general with the unemployment bonuses of $400, or I think in the final bill now they changed it to $300, but it's 300 tax-exempt dollars, which is probably pretty comparable to the $400 depending on someone's tax situation, and that's on top of your state benefits, and so that's going to keep millions of people out of the workforce. And as the economy picks back up, a lot of employers are going to find that they can't afford to pay people more than what they're making on unemployment. So it's very hard to get people to come to work when you can't afford to pay them more than what they're making on unemployment, which is more than they were making when they were working. And so I do really worry that all of the money that's being pushed out of Washington is going to have a major distortive effect on the labor market and make it hard to get people back in the workforce and working again. And the $300 a month child credit, for instance, I could see situations where some people are trying to just live on that and not work, or and a lot of the free money that comes out from Washington, I worry, is also going to be spent on drugs and other socially pathological things. And so I do think that there are real questions about how do you finance a paid leave benefit and make sure that it's not a crushing tax burden or an unfunded mandate on employers. But I think that's kind of the least of our problems with all the other things that are coming down right now, and just all of the free money from Washington and the unemployment bonuses in particular, and the impact that's going to have on the ability to fill positions and kind of get things up and running again.
I'm going to throw two out here. Certainly we've seen at the gas pump, gas prices have been creeping up over the last couple of months now. And again, that leads also to electric prices are probably going to go up generation there where, the power plants are struggling and still with the burden of a lot of folks working from home. Phil, the cost of living is, I think, pointing to the beginnings of an inflationary cycle, and inflation is classically terrifically bad for the poorest among us. They become even more abjectly poor, despite what may seem like statistically good sounding news stories. What about the inflationary cycle that all this magic mystical money that seems to be coming out of these programs and vanishing into state coffers is going to create?
I think that we're on the front end of pretty substantial inflation. Now, having said that, I've said that a lot of times over the last decade or so, and I've been wrong every time, so I could be wrong again. But you look at the amount of money creation that's going on, the run-up in commodity prices that we've already seen, the fact that, as you said, we're already seeing a substantial increase in energy prices in particular. And I think energy prices could go much, much higher because we've got now new supply constraints with the ban on production on federal lands and waters from Biden and the banning of the Keystone Pipeline. We've got global demand rising again as the economy picks up, not just in the U.S. but globally. And you've got money creation from the Fed. So you've got sort of a triple whammy that could drive gasoline prices back to $4 or $5 or even higher when the economy really gets back humming again, assuming that the supply constraints are still on. So that's going to be a significant factor. But you look at the interest rate signals that we're already seeing. We saw the 10-year yield up over 1.6 last week for the first time in a year, and the big question mark I think is would the Fed tap the brakes if we start to see substantial inflationary pressures emerging with all the government spending and everything that's happening? And I don't think they would. I think that they. From a balance of risk standpoint and sort of the way they've been operating over the last couple of chairs, I don't think they would tap the brakes, and therefore, if inflation does pick up, I could see it rise pretty rapidly to a pretty substantial level, a level a lot of people haven't seen during their lifetimes, potentially even.
As a group I call goth economists, they sort of are the ones who are, like living in Eeyore's gloomy place in the 100-acre wood, have told me in the past that inflation is about the only way we can survive because it's the only way we're going to substantially cut into our national debt. I'm not quite sure how it works. Didn't do that well in economics in school. I grasped the basic concepts, but this seems to be a little bit more. Could that be partially why Janet Yellen might say, yeah, we want to let some inflation happen to help us get this debt down?
Certainly possible. The national debt's around 28 trillion. I think we're probably going to add another 4 to 6 over the next year, which is incomprehensible. Mm-hmm. Unless you're going to have massive tax increases, the debt service burden is going to become pretty substantial. The challenge is if you think you're going to inflate away the debt by having a de facto devaluation of the dollar, the problem is that inflation comes with rising interest rates, which means when you have to roll over that debt, it's going to be expensive to finance it in nominal terms, and so you're sort of chasing your tail in that sense. But. Mm-hmm. So, I don't think, for that reason, I don't think it's an intentional solution to the debt, but it would have the effect of lowering the burden of the debt, all else equal. The challenge becomes, when you need to roll the debt over, you've got to pay substantially higher interest rates.
Phil Kerpen, American Commitment. We were talking about the COVID lockdowns and what they've devastated, even to the point where liberal enclaves like Stanford, they're admitting, yeah, this was a mistake. You mentioned California versus Florida. At some point, somebody at Disney is going to say, can we open a theme park, please?
Well, they're letting them open at 15% capacity in California.
Oh, are they?
They can't make money at that, but they're going to do it anyway because I guess they'd rather, get their toe in the water.
We were talking about the debt, and I'm going to throw a more scary scenario at our senior population than COVID-19, which, as you said, is more dire of a virus for our elderly. A lot of that debt that you talked about, $28 trillion, is owed to the Social Security Administration. A lot of that bond is there. Also, China, they do own quite a bit of it. But last time I checked, the largest single note holder of our debt was the Social Security Administration. Is that an issue that's got to be addressed at some point?
Well, we've had a couple of big opportunities when we had sort of a bright fiscal picture at the federal level, efforts to put real savings and investment into Social Security, and Bill Clinton was about to do it, and then the Lewinsky scandal happened, and he sort of fell back into a standard partisan left and shrank from it. And of course, Bush tried to do it and failed. But the consequence is that we don't have real investment in the Social Security Trust Fund. It just purchases special issue government bonds. Essentially, it's borrowing out of its own. The government borrows, takes from its left pocket and pays the benefit out of its right. And the bonds are really notional in that the financing options for Social Security are the same as if the bonds didn't exist at all. You still need to finance current benefits out of current revenues, and when you exhaust that, you've got to find transfers to make good on the benefit payments. And so it's essentially run as if the trust fund doesn't exist. It holds no real assets that affect it from an accounting standpoint. And the ability of the government to pay those benefits depends on the future revenues in the program, which depend on the economy growing at a sufficient pace to generate enough revenue to pay for the big the massive cohort of baby boomers that are now entering retirement. And those numbers don't quite work. So we need substantial general fund transfers to make good on those benefits. And of course, that further squeezes, the federal budget or further inflates the federal deficit and debt. And at some point, there has to be some kind of a reckoning on that. And so it's one of the contributors. I don't know that you're going to see any significant change to that. In fact, if anything, with the current crowd that we have, they want to increase benefits, and they don't really care about the fiscal situation. They think that just raising or eliminating the wage cap and increasing taxes can solve it, which is a very short-term fix, and of course has major economic downside. And so I don't think we're going to see anything done on Social Security with the current Congress. But if we do, it would probably be something that makes it worse, not better. So
one remembers Paul Krugman on ABC talking about the advisability of care panels, and you wonder, right? Phil, it is always a joy catching up with you, even in dire stories like this. The lockdowns are not good, have not been good. What do you see economically coming out of it with the PRO Act now running through Congress? As one of my alert listeners pointed out, it sounds like the medieval guild system all over again, and further punishing entrepreneurial spirit after a pandemic where a lot of people only survived because of being able to go out and work for DoorDash or Instacart or that kind of thing. What does the economy look like in the future? Because I do trust your foresight, even though we have talked about inflation in the past. I still think it's out there. You just you were too early for it. What do we look like coming in the next 3, 4, 5 months? What are we less restrictive or more restrictive?
I think that we're going to generally be less restrictive. I think that we're very close to general vaccine availability in most places, and the president's May 1st deadline for that is pretty unambitious. Most states will be there, within a couple of weeks. Certainly by the first or second week of April, I think almost all states will be at general availability on the vaccine. And my view is that once you're at general availability on the vaccine, there's really no leg to stand on for any kinds of restrictions and rules and regulations and limitations, because anyone who chooses not to get the vaccine when it's generally available has made a personal choice, and that personal choice does not increase the risk for anyone else, because anyone else who wants the vaccine would have the choice to get it, and they can make that choice. And so I think at that point, the rationale for any of these restrictions really melts away, and I think that logic will become irresistible even to people on the left, because people are just so fed up. They've had enough, I think, of all these restrictions. So I think they're going to mostly crumble over the next couple of months as anyone who wants the vaccine is able to get it. And that's going to be a really big kind of relief rally for the whole economy and for people going back out and doing things maybe they were scared to do or they weren't willing to do. And that's going to be a huge, huge positive. And then we're going to have kind of these offsetting effects. We're going to have that positive versus the negative of all the bad policy in the bill they already passed. And, of course, if they did something like the PRO Act, which bans state right-to-work laws, I mean, you wouldn't be a right-to-work state anymore.
Yeah,
well, you're not going to be anyway because of your legislature. But none of the states would be right-to-work states anymore. And, you think about how much better right-to-work states have performed economically historically than forced unionism states, and that's a total catastrophe. And then, as you pointed out, they also destroy gig work in that same bill. So that would be a real economic disaster if it passed. I don't think that passes unless they kill the filibuster in the Senate. But Manchin's been talking about that again, and if they're willing to do that, and it's sort of Katie barred the door. Not only will that bill pass, but their crazy election takeover bill will pass, and their gun control and all their other stuff. And so we could have a sort of, if the dam breaks in terms of the filibuster, we could have a whole series of legislative disasters.
I feel what you're saying. I hear it out there. I wonder if President Biden's prediction about Independence Day is more going to be Interdependence Day, just out of our fear. What is it? As I said, Governor Northam's press conferences come from a building that bears the name of the guy that said, "Give me liberty or give me death," and he's out there saying, "For the fear of death, give up your liberty." And we seem to be at all too large a number okay with that, and that's the worry that too many Andrew Yang supporters are looking at our liberty dividend and saying, "Well, this is actually kind of cool. Keep this up."
Well, I do think that a lot of where these policies are headed is towards some kind of universal basic income. When you think about, the $400 a week unemployment bonus, and then the $300 a month child credit, and if you're pushing all of this cash welfare essentially out the door, it's pretty easy to come back and say, well, the way we're going to restore work incentives is we're going to give it to everyone instead of, stopping giving it to people who are not working. And, that becomes difficult to resist on some level. The sad thing about all of this, Joe, is that, we've tried cash welfare before. It causes a lot more problems than it solves, and that's why we moved away from it. And I think this idea of just sending out lots and lots of cash is going to cause a lot of problems people haven't necessarily thought about. When the first stimulus checks went out last year, we had this massive spike in drug overdose deaths because a lot of that money was used to buy drugs. And I really worry that a lot of the money that we're just pushing out willy-nilly is going to be spent on things that are destructive rather than, economically helpful.
Well, again, and when you look at some of the socioeconomic event, we're seeing a lot of the same depression and drug abuse, alcohol abuse that you see on Native American reservations that we've seen for decades, and the numbers are starting to track the same because we're getting the same message. Listen, we don't need you right now, so just stay here and we'll send some money at the end of the month. And I mean, that's a lot of people may sound like it sounds like a great idea at first. By the end of the first week, you're really starting to get down on yourself about it, Phil. And so I appreciate everything you do at American Commitment. And he's got a great piece at the American Spectator. It'll be linked up to this piece. I really appreciate your visit this week, and I hope you have a marvelous Easter and have a great springtime starting. All
right. Same to you. Have a good one.
Cynthia Dunbar, she is the Republican National Committee member for Virginia, H.R. 5 and more. Coming up next on Freedom and Prosperity Radio.